My name is Angela Carter, and I am 42 years old. I have lived in Atlanta, Georgia, for most of my life, though I grew up in a smaller town about an hour outside the city. I like to think of myself as a woman who has worked hard for everything she has, even if most people don't really see it. I'm not someone who wears my achievements on my sleeve. For many years, my life has been about survival, about making sure my son had what he needed, about showing up every day and pushing through, even when nobody seemed to notice. I raised my son, Marcus, mostly on my own. His father wasn't around much after he turned 5. At first, it was heartbreaking. I had imagined a family that stayed together, a man who would stand by me, a partner who would share the weight of life's burdens. But reality doesn't always look like our hopes. So I became mother and father in one, working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep the lights on. I cleaned houses. I cooked for other families. I worked night shifts in hotel laundries. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. Marcus grew up seeing me tired, sometimes with aching hands and a sore back, but he also grew up seeing my determination. I told him often, life doesn't hand you respect. You earn it. And when people don't see your worth, you make sure you see it for yourself. I hope those words stayed with him. When he got into college, I thought it was one of the proudest days of my life. I remember standing outside the admissions office with him, tears running down my cheeks, because I knew what it had taken to get there. I knew how many nights I had cried quietly while folding someone else's laundry or scrubbing another family's floor, wondering if any of it would pay off. And in that moment, seeing him walk into that future, I believed it had. Fast forward a few years, Marcus met a woman named Stephanie. She was beautiful, ambitious, and from a family that had money. Real money. The kind that makes people walk differently, as if the ground is softer beneath their shoes. I could see why he was taken with her. She carried herself with confidence, and she seemed to know what she wanted out of life. When Marcus brought her home to meet me, I did my best to make her comfortable. I cooked a full meal, chicken with collard greens and cornbread, food that meant home to me. She was polite, but I caught the way she looked at my house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom home with old furniture and faded paint. I saw the flicker in her eyes, the kind that measures you, that decides who you are before you even open your mouth. Still, I welcomed her. I wanted to believe she would love Marcus enough to also respect the people who had made him who he was. Over time, though, small things started to add up. She never asked me much about my life. When she introduced me to her parents at a dinner once, she said, "This is Marcus's mom, Angela," and her mother's eyes lingered on my hands, rough from years of work. Her father barely nodded. It was clear to me they thought Marcus was marrying beneath their world, but I stayed silent. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought. Then came the wedding. Stephanie's family wanted it at an exclusive venue in downtown Atlanta, the kind of place where people take photos just to prove they've been there. Marble floors, high ceilings with chandeliers, staff moving quietly in black uniforms. It was luxury from the front door to the last chair. The cost was more than I could imagine spending, but her family offered to cover much of it. Marcus told me he wanted me to just relax, enjoy the moment, and not worry about money. What Marcus and Stephanie didn't know, though, was that I had a connection to that venue. Years ago, I had worked there, not as a guest, not as someone taking photos in a gown or sipping champagne at the bar, but as part of the cleaning crew. I spent weekends polishing those marble floors, scrubbing those bathrooms, making sure those crystal chandeliers sparkled for the people who could afford to walk under them. Back then, I kept my head down and my work steady, but I remembered every detail of that place. Walking in for the rehearsal dinner, I felt a strange mixture of pride and nerves. Pride, because my son had made it to this moment. Nerves, because I knew exactly how the people in Stephanie's circle looked at women like me. I wore my best dress, navy blue with a simple silver necklace. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine, bought with my own hard-earned money. The day of the wedding arrived, and the venue glowed with golden light. Guests filled the room, the air thick with perfume, laughter, and clinking glasses. I stayed near Marcus for much of the morning, helping where I could, adjusting his tie, smoothing his collar like I had when he was a little boy. He smiled at me with the same warmth he always had, and for a while, I forgot all my worries. But everything changed just before the ceremony began. Stephanie was nervous, pacing back and forth in her suite. She had misplaced something, a bracelet, I think. People were moving in and out of the room, trying to keep her calm. I stepped in quietly, wanting to offer a hand. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked gently. That was when it happened. Stephanie turned sharply toward me, her eyes flashing with irritation. Her voice cut through the chatter in the room, louder than she probably realized. "You're just a cleaner," she shouted. "Stay out of the way." For a moment, silence fell. Heads turned. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, some wide with shock, others carefully avoiding my gaze. The words stung deeper than I expected. Not because I was ashamed of the work I had done, never that. I had cleaned to feed my son, to keep a roof over his head, to build the very foundation that had led him to this day. What hurt was the disdain. The way she reduced all those years of sacrifice into something to be sneered at, something to humiliate me with. I looked at her, and for a second, I thought about saying nothing, about swallowing the pain like I had so many times before. But inside me, something shifted. This was my son's wedding, my family's moment too. I wasn't going to let anyone erase me from it. I drew in a breath, steadying myself. The truth was, she had no idea who she was speaking to, not really. Because while she saw me as just a cleaner, what she didn't know was that the very place she was standing in, this venue filled with chandeliers and marble, was tied to me in ways she couldn't imagine. And as I stood there, with the eyes of her family and my son's friends on me, I realized I wasn't going to let this pass. Not this time. The ceremony began not long after that moment, but I couldn't shake the sting of her words. As I sat in the second row, waiting for the music to play, I replayed what had just happened in my mind over and over. "You're just a cleaner." I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus on Marcus. He stood tall at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him, looking every bit the man I had prayed he would become. My son wasn't perfect, but he had always been good, kind, and steady. Watching him smile as the music began, I felt a rush of pride that was stronger than the pain still burning in my chest. Stephanie walked down the aisle like she had stepped out of a magazine cover, her gown flowing, her makeup flawless, her chin tilted ever so slightly upward. The guests whispered their admiration, phones subtly lifting to capture the moment. All eyes were on her, which is exactly what she wanted. The vows went smoothly. Marcus spoke from the heart, his voice warm as he promised to honor and cherish her. Stephanie's words were polished, rehearsed, like lines from a movie, but Marcus didn't seem to notice. His eyes stayed locked on her with a devotion that softened the edges of my anger. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause filled the room. Marcus kissed his bride, and the crowd erupted in cheers. I clapped too, but my hands felt heavy, my smile tight. Inside, I was still bleeding from what she had said. The reception followed in the grand ballroom. Tables glittered with glassware and candles, plates carried out by servers in crisp uniforms. Guests mingled, laughter spilling into the air along with the music. I took my seat at one of the family tables, sipping on water, trying to blend into the background. But my mind was racing. I thought about the years I had worked in that very building, cleaning after events like this one. I remembered sweeping the floor after weddings, listening to the echoes of laughter as the last guests left, gathering the discarded programs and half-empty glasses. I remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to watch people celebrate while I stood in the shadows with a mop in my hand. And here I was now, not as staff but as the mother of the groom. Still, with one careless sentence, Stephanie had shoved me right back into those shadows. A woman at my table leaned over, lowering her voice. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. It was one of Stephanie's aunts, I think. "I'm fine," I answered quickly, though my voice betrayed me. She gave me a small, sympathetic smile before turning back to her plate. I knew she had heard. Everyone had. The speeches began soon after. Stephanie's father went first, raising his glass with a proud smile. He spoke about family legacy and how grateful he was that his daughter had found a man like Marcus. His words were polished, rehearsed, and meant to impress. People clapped, some dabbing their eyes. Then it was my turn. Marcus had asked me weeks ago if I would say a few words, and I had agreed, even though public speaking has never been easy for me. I stood, my hands trembling slightly as I held the microphone. "Good evening," I began, my voice quieter than I wanted. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Good evening. I'm Angela Carter, Marcus's mother. First, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate this special day." I looked over at Marcus, his face glowing with love and pride. That gave me strength. "Marcus," I said, turning toward him, "I have watched you grow from a little boy with scraped knees and endless questions into the man you are today. You've made me proud in more ways than I can count. I always told you to stand tall, to respect yourself, and to never forget where you came from. And standing here tonight, I see that you've carried those lessons with you." A lump formed in my throat, but I pushed through. "I may not have had much to give you in material things, but I gave you everything I had: my time, my energy, my love. And seeing you here tonight, I know it was all worth it." The room was quiet. I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air. I glanced at Stephanie then. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were distant, almost impatient, as if she just wanted me to finish. That familiar sting returned, but I didn't let it show. "So, here's my wish for both of you," I continued. "May your marriage be built on respect, honesty, and understanding. Because at the end of the day, those are the things that last when everything else fades away." I raised my glass, my hand steady now, to Marcus and Stephanie. The guests repeated my toast, glasses clinking around the room. I sat back down, my heart pounding but lighter somehow. I had said what I needed to say, not everything, but enough. Still, the night pressed on with a heaviness in my chest. Every laugh from Stephanie's side of the family, every sideways glance, reminded me of the divide between us. And then came the moment that changed everything. As dinner ended and the music picked up, Marcus came over to me. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked quietly. I smiled, not wanting to ruin his night. "Of course, baby. Don't worry about me." But he frowned. I heard what she said earlier. His voice was low, careful. My breath caught. "Marcus," he shook his head. "I know. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I heard, and it wasn't right." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "This is your day. Don't let anything ruin it." He looked torn, his jaw tight. But then Stephanie called for him, and he slid back into the crowd, into his role as the groom. I watched him walk away, and something inside me hardened, because Marcus didn't know the full truth. He didn't know that I had worked in that very venue for years, that my sweat had polished its floors, that my hands had scrubbed its bathrooms, that my labor had kept it shining for families like Stephanie's. And he didn't know something else, something I had kept quiet. The woman who owned this venue, Mrs. Whitaker, had been more than just an employer to me. She had been a mentor, a guide, someone who saw my worth even when I didn't. And years ago, before she passed away, she left me something in her will. Ownership, partial, but significant, enough to matter. So while Stephanie and her family strutted through the hallways as if they owned the place, the truth was, part of this venue belonged to me. And as I sat there, the chandelier light glinting off the crystal glasses, I realized that maybe it was time they found that out. I barely slept that night. Even after the last song was played and the final toast was made, my mind wouldn't rest. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of my little house, I kept hearing Stephanie's voice echo, "You're just a cleaner." But along with the sting of humiliation, there was another sound in my head, the quiet, steady voice of Mrs. Whitaker, the woman who had once changed my life. I remembered the first time I met her. I was 30 years old, desperate for steady work. Marcus was still in middle school, and I had just lost one of my cleaning contracts. Bills were piling up, and I felt like I was drowning. A friend told me about a position at Whitaker Hall, a grand event venue downtown. I applied, half expecting to be ignored, but Mrs. Whitaker herself interviewed me. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair always pulled back into a neat bun. But what struck me most was the way she looked at me, not past me, not through me, but directly at me. She asked about my experience, my work ethic, and most of all, my goals. I had never been asked that in a job interview before. "What do you want for yourself, Angela?" she had said, her voice soft but firm. I remember stammering something about stability, about wanting to provide for my son. She nodded, as if that answer was enough. "Then you'll do well here," she said. Working at Whitaker Hall was hard, but it gave me a sense of dignity I hadn't felt in a long time. Mrs. Whitaker treated her staff like family. She often walked the halls, speaking with us by name, asking about our children, remembering details that most people with money never cared about. Over time, she took a special interest in me. Maybe she saw my determination, or maybe she recognized something familiar in my struggle. She began teaching me things outside of cleaning, about business, about managing staff, about contracts and bookings. She let me shadow her during meetings, saying, "Pay attention, Angela. One day, you'll need to know how this works." I didn't fully understand then why she was so invested in me, but I listened, I learned, and when she passed away suddenly, the news shattered me. But then came the reading of her will, and with it, the revelation that left me speechless. She had left me a minority share in Whitaker Hall. It wasn't enough to make me rich or to control the business outright, but it was enough to give me a seat at the table, enough to make me part owner. Her nephew managed most of the operations now, but legally, I still held my share. I had never flaunted it. To me, it wasn't something to show off, but a quiet reminder of what someone saw in me when I didn't see it in myself. A reminder that my worth wasn't defined by the mop in my hands. And now, as I thought about Stephanie's words, I felt that reminder burning like a flame in my chest. The morning after the wedding, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward. My phone buzzed with messages, congratulations from relatives, photos of Marcus and Stephanie beaming at the reception, little snippets of joy. But beneath it all, I couldn't shake the storm inside me. Marcus called around noon. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle, "I just wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," I answered automatically. "You don't sound fine." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Marcus, yesterday was your wedding day. That's what matters." There was a pause. "I don't want you to feel pushed aside." I heard what she said. I can't pretend I didn't. My heart squeezed. "Marcus, I've lived a long time being underestimated." What she said, it hurt, yes, but I've survived worse. He hesitated before speaking again. "Still, she was wrong, and I'm going to make sure she knows that." "Don't fight my battles for me," I said softly. "I can handle myself." The truth was, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to handle it, but I knew I wouldn't let this pass. 2 days later, I received an email from Whitaker Hall. They were holding a quarterly shareholder meeting, as they always did, and my presence was requested. Normally, I skipped those meetings and signed papers quietly from the sidelines, but this time, I felt different. I showed up early, walking through the familiar marble entrance with my head held high. The chandeliers sparkled just as I remembered, the staff moving swiftly to prepare for another event later that evening. For a moment, I almost felt like I had stepped back in time, back to the days when I wore a uniform and carried a bucket. But this time, I walked straight past the staff and into the boardroom. Inside, a few men and women were already seated around the long mahogany table. Mr. Whitaker's nephew, Charles, stood at the head, shuffling papers. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Angela," he said, forcing a polite smile, "I didn't realize you'd be attending today. I thought it was about time," I replied evenly, taking my seat. The meeting began with numbers and projections, talk of upcoming bookings, and discussions of maintenance costs. I listened carefully, jotting down notes. When my turn came to sign the shareholder report, I did so with steady hands. But as I left the building, I knew this wasn't just about paperwork. This was about reclaiming my voice. That weekend, Marcus invited me to dinner at their new apartment. Stephanie answered the door, her smile tight. "Angela," she said, her tone clipped. "Stephanie," I replied, keeping my voice calm. Marcus greeted me warmly, hugging me tight. We sat down to eat, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Stephanie made small talk, asking me about my week as if nothing had happened. But her eyes avoided mine, darting toward Marcus instead. Halfway through the meal, Marcus excused himself to take a phone call. The room grew quiet, just the two of us sitting across the table. Stephanie finally spoke, her voice low. I shouldn't have said what I did at the wedding. I looked at her, waiting. She shifted in her seat. I was stressed. I didn't mean it like that. My chest tightened. You meant it exactly like that, I said quietly. And that's the problem. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. You think my worth is tied to the work I've done, I continued, my voice steady. But you don't know me. You don't know what I've built, or what I've endured. You saw me as less, and you tried to put me in my place. Her eyes flickered with something, shame, maybe, or anger. I couldn't tell. Here's what you should know, I said, leaning forward slightly. That place you got married in? Whitaker Hall? I've scrubbed its floors. I've polished its windows. And today, I own a part of it. So when you stood there and told me I was just a cleaner, you were standing in a building that bears my name on its deeds. Her face went pale. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was enough. Marcus returned then, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. We finished dinner with polite conversation, but Stephanie barely touched her food. As I walked home later, the cool night air on my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the kind that comes from money or titles, but the kind that comes from standing in your truth, from refusing to be silenced. Stephanie might have tried to humiliate me, but the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed dinner at Marcus and Stephanie's apartment were quieter on the surface, but beneath that silence, currents were shifting. I could feel it. Marcus was happy, still basking in the glow of being newly married. But Stephanie? She carried herself differently around me now, more cautious, less bold. That look in her eyes when I told her about Whitaker Hall had left an impression. I didn't plan to wield my connection to the venue like a weapon, but I also wasn't going to shrink anymore. For too long, I had allowed myself to be underestimated, to be polite even in the face of disrespect. But something about that moment at the wedding had lit a fire in me. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by my house. He sat at my kitchen table, sipping the sweet tea I had made, his eyes studying me. Mom, I can't stop thinking about what happened at the wedding, he said finally. I stirred sugar into my own glass, avoiding his gaze. Marcus, you don't need to keep worrying about it. He shook his head. No, I do. Stephanie feels bad, but I don't think she really understands what she did. I raised an eyebrow. And do you understand? He hesitated. I think so. You've always worked hard. I've seen it my whole life. But I don't think I realized what it cost you. How much you sacrificed. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. Marcus, everything I did for you. I didn't need thanks. I needed to know you'd have a future. He leaned forward, his eyes soft. I know, and I'll never forget it. For the first time in days, I felt some of the heaviness lift. Whatever battles I had with Stephanie, at least my son saw me. At least he knew. Still, I couldn't ignore the whispers that were beginning to spread. Word had traveled quickly after the wedding. Atlanta society had a way of chewing up gossip and spitting it out faster than you could blink. People were talking about Stephanie's outburst, about the tension in the bride's suite. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, but all of it left a sour taste in my mouth. The turning point came when Charles, Mrs. Whitaker's nephew, called me. Angela, he said over the phone, I thought you should know Stephanie reached out to us. I frowned. About what? She wants to book Whitaker Hall again. For a charity gala. She mentioned your son and said she wanted the family to be involved. I sat in silence, processing his words. Stephanie, booking the very place she had once dismissed me for cleaning. Do you want us to move forward? Charles asked cautiously. Yes, I said after a moment. But I'll be there. This time, I won't be invisible. The night of the gala, I arrived early. The ballroom shimmered, candles casting soft light against the high ceilings. Guests filed in dressed in elegant gowns and tailored suits, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. I wore a simple black dress with pearl earrings, nothing flashy, but enough to remind myself that I belonged there. When Marcus and Stephanie arrived, all eyes turned. She looked radiant, greeting people with polished charm. But when her gaze landed on me, her smile faltered for just a moment. "Angela," she said, approaching with a glass of champagne in hand. Her tone was smooth, practiced. "I'm glad you could come tonight. I wouldn't miss it," I replied calmly. Marcus joined us, his arm sliding around her waist. "Mom, isn't this place beautiful tonight?" he asked, his voice full of pride. "Yes," I said, letting my eyes linger on the chandeliers. "It always is." Stephanie stiffened slightly at my words. Later that evening, Charles took the stage to thank everyone for attending. He spoke about the importance of community, generosity, and legacy. Then, to my surprise, he said, "I'd also like to acknowledge one of our shareholders who is here tonight, someone whose contributions often go unseen, but whose impact is undeniable. Please join me in welcoming Angela Carter." The room broke into polite applause. Heat rose in my cheeks as I stood, nodding toward the crowd. Marcus's eyes widened, and Stephanie froze beside him, her smile glued in place. Afterward, Marcus pulled me aside. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I looked him in the eye. "Because it wasn't about titles or ownership. It was about building a life. But now it matters that people know I'm more than what she called me." His expression softened, a mixture of shock and pride. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick. But the most satisfying moment came later, when Stephanie and I crossed paths near the dessert table. She avoided my gaze at first, then finally spoke. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "You didn't ask," I replied. Her lips parted, but she said nothing more. For the rest of the night, she was quieter, her confidence dulled by the weight of what she had learned. As I drove home after the gala, the city lights glowing against the night sky, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also sadness. Sadness that respect had to be demanded rather than given freely. Sadness that my son's wife saw me as a title, a position instead of as a person. Still, one thing was clear. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the invisible cleaner in the background. I was a woman who had built something, who had endured, who owned her place in that room. And whether Stephanie liked it or not, she would have to reckon with that. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. After the gala, life seemed to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Marcus called me often, checking in as though he sensed there was more beneath the surface. Stephanie, on the other hand, kept her distance. She was polite when we crossed paths, but her warmth was gone, replaced by a brittle kind of courtesy that felt rehearsed. I didn't mind. Respect, whether sincere or forced, was better than open disdain. Still, I could feel the cracks forming in their marriage, subtle but there. Marcus was too in love, too hopeful to notice, but I had lived long enough to recognize when tension was brewing under a pretty surface. One evening, Marcus stopped by unannounced. I was in the middle of folding laundry when I heard his knock. "Marcus," I said with surprise, opening the door. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to talk," he said, stepping inside. His eyes were troubled, his usual easy smile gone. I set the basket aside and gestured for him to sit. "What's wrong?" He sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "Stephanie's been different since the wedding, since the gala, especially." I stayed quiet, letting him gather his thoughts. "She doesn't like that people are talking about you," he continued, "about your ownership in Whitaker Hall. She said it makes her feel overshadowed." My chest tightened. "Marcus, my intention was never to compete with her. I was simply standing in my truth." "I know that, Mom," he said quickly. "But Stephanie sees everything as a contest. She's used to being the center of attention, and now she feels like you're taking that away from her." I leaned back, studying him. "And what do you think?" He hesitated before answering. "I think she's being unfair, but she's my wife, and I need to keep the peace." His words stung, though I tried not to show it. "Keeping peace doesn't mean ignoring disrespect," I said softly. Marcus looked at me torn. "I don't know how to fix this." I reached for his hand, squeezing it. "The only thing you can do is be honest with yourself, with her, and with me. Everything else will fall into place in time." He nodded, but his eyes were heavy with doubt. Over the next few weeks, the tension only grew. Stephanie avoided inviting me to gatherings, always finding an excuse. Marcus visited me alone more often, and when he did, he spoke less about the joys of marriage and more about its difficulties. She says I'm not ambitious enough, he confessed one afternoon as we walked through Piedmont Park. That I don't push hard enough, that I'm too content. I stopped, looking at him. Marcus, ambition isn't about climbing ladders for the sake of being seen. It's about building something that matters to you. Don't let her shame you into chasing her definition of success. He nodded, but the crease in his forehead remained. Then came the dinner party. Stephanie's parents hosted it in their sprawling Buckhead mansion, a house so large it could have swallowed my little home 10 times over. Marcus insisted I attend, even though I suspected Stephanie would have preferred otherwise. I wore a simple burgundy dress and carried myself with quiet dignity. When I arrived, the room was already buzzing with conversation. Waiters floated around with trays of hors d'oeuvres and the air smelled of roasted lamb and expensive wine. Stephanie greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Angela," she said coolly, "I'm glad you could come. Thank you for inviting me," I replied, my voice even. Throughout the evening, I noticed how carefully she maneuvered the conversation. Whenever someone mentioned Whitaker Hall, she quickly redirected. When people asked about Marcus, she emphasized his connection to her world, her charities, her family's wealth. It was subtle, but deliberate. At one point, a guest asked me directly, "Angela, how did you come to be part of Whitaker Hall?" I smiled gently, setting my glass down. "I worked there for many years. Mrs. Whitaker took me under her wing and before she passed, she left me a share of the venue." The guest's eyebrows rose with interest. "Remarkable. She must have seen something special in you." "I suppose she did," I said softly. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably, her knuckles wide around her wine glass. Later in the evening, as dessert was being served, I excused myself to the garden for some air. The night was cool, the city lights glittering in the distance. I stood quietly, taking in the stillness, when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Stephanie. "Why do you have to keep bringing it up?" she hissed, her voice sharp but low enough that others inside couldn't hear. I turned, startled. "Bringing what up?" "Whitaker Hall," she snapped. "Everywhere we go, people are talking about you. About your ownership, your connection. This is supposed to be our world. Marcus's and mine, not yours." My stomach tightened. "Stephanie, I didn't bring it up. People ask me questions, and I answered truthfully. I'm not hiding who I am just to make you comfortable." Her eyes blazed. "You're embarrassing us. You make Marcus look small next to you." The words hit me like a slap. I steadied myself before answering. "Marcus doesn't look small. He looks like a man who was raised with love and integrity. If you can't see that, then the problem isn't with me, it's with you." She stared at me, her chest rising and falling quickly. For a moment, I thought she might explode. But instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back inside. I stayed in the garden a while longer, letting the cool air calm me. When I finally returned, I noticed Marcus watching me with concern. He didn't ask in front of everyone, but I knew he would later. And he did. That night, after he dropped me home, he sat in his car with the engine idling. "What happened between you and Stephanie?" he asked gently. I hesitated, then told him the truth. "She's threatened by me, by what I represent. She thinks your worth is measured against mine, and she doesn't understand that love doesn't work that way." Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how to make this better." I reached over, resting my hand on his arm. "Some things, Marcus, you can't make better. Some things people have to learn on their own." He nodded slowly, but his face was clouded with worry. As I watched him drive away, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. I didn't want to be the wedge between them, but Stephanie had made it clear this wasn't just about me. It was about control, about whose story would dominate. And something told me she wasn't done fighting. The weeks after the dinner party were tense, like a storm hovering just beyond the horizon. Marcus visited often, but his eyes carried a weight. I recognized a man torn between two loyalties. Stephanie, meanwhile, kept her distance, though I knew she was working quietly in the background, trying to steer things her way. One evening, Marcus showed up at my door looking more tired than I had ever seen him. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his shoulders slumped. Marcus, I said, ushering him in. What's wrong? He sank onto my couch, burying his face in his hands. Mom, she's talking about moving. Stephanie wants us to relocate to New York. She says Atlanta isn't big enough for her ambitions. I froze. New York? He nodded. She says the city has more opportunities, better networking, bigger stages. But I don't want to leave. My job is here. My life is here. You're here. I sat down beside him, placing a hand on his back. Marcus, marriage is about compromise. But if she's asking you to give up everything that matters to you while she refuses to bend, that's not compromise, that's control. He looked at me, his eyes tired and searching. I don't want to lose her, Mom, but I don't want to lose myself either. My heart ached. Then you need to decide which loss you can live with, because one of them is inevitable if things continue this way. The silence between us was heavy, but it was the truth he needed to hear. A few days later, Charles called me from Whitaker Hall. Angela, I thought you should know Stephanie approached me again. She wants to host another event here, this time in her name, a charity ball, but she insisted your involvement be minimized. My stomach tightened. What exactly did she say? She asked if there was a way to keep your ownership out of the spotlight. She said it confuses people. Heat flared in my chest. Confuses them? Or threatens her? Charles hesitated. I told her the shareholders are public record. We can't erase you, Angela, but I wanted you to know she's trying. I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling. Stephanie wasn't just uncomfortable with me, she was actively trying to erase me. The ball was set for the following month. When the night came, I dressed in a deep emerald gown that clung softly at the waist, paired with simple gold earrings. I wasn't there to flaunt, but I wasn't going to shrink either. The venue glittered with luxury. Guests mingled, their voices rising over the music of a live quartet. Stephanie floated through the crowd like a practiced hostess, her smile polished, her hand resting lightly on Marcus's arm. But every time her gaze landed on me, that smile faltered. During dinner, a local journalist approached me. Miss Carter, he said warmly, I've heard fascinating things about your history with Whitaker Hall. Would you mind sharing a bit? I glanced at Stephanie across the table. Her expression tightened. I turned back to the journalist and smiled. Of course. I started here as part of the cleaning staff. I worked nights polishing these very floors, cleaning these very rooms. And over time, the woman who owned this place, Mrs. Whitaker, saw something in me. She gave me an opportunity I never imagined, and that's why I'm proud to say I'm still connected to this hall today as a shareholder. The journalist's eyes lit up, scribbling notes. Guests nearby leaned in, clearly intrigued. Stephanie's fork clattered against her plate. Later, in the hallway, she cornered me. Her voice was sharp, low, and trembling with anger. Why did you have to say that? Why couldn't you just smile and deflect? Because it's the truth, I replied calmly. No, she snapped. It's your version of the truth, and it makes me look like I married into less than what I deserve. My chest tightened, but my voice stayed steady. Stephanie, your value doesn't come from the money you flaunt or the names you drop. It comes from how you treat people. And if you can't see that, then no amount of glittering parties will fill the emptiness inside you. Her eyes narrowed. You'll ruin him. You'll drag Marcus down with your humility. For a moment, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the fire in her eyes told me she meant every word. Marcus isn't being dragged down, I said firmly. He's being grounded. And one day, you'll realize the difference. She spun on her heel and stormed away, leaving me standing alone in the corridor. By the end of the night, I could see the cracks widening between them. Marcus tried to smile, tried to keep the evening light, but I caught the way his eyes followed Stephanie, the way he frowned when she brushed him off. A week later, Marcus called again. His voice was heavy. Mom, we had a fight. A bad one. I held the phone tighter. What happened? She said I don't measure up, that she regrets marrying someone who doesn't match her drive. She said she feels like she's settled. His voice broke. Mom, she called me a disappointment. The pain in his voice pierced me deeper than anything she had ever said to me. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of strength I had, was being crushed under her contempt. Marcus, I said softly, steadying my voice, you are not a disappointment. You're everything I ever dreamed you would be. And if she can't see that, then the failure is hers, not yours." He was silent, but I could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he whispered finally. My heart ached, but I knew this was his battle now. I could only remind him of his worth, stand as the anchor he needed. As I hung up the phone that night, I stared out the window at the city lights. Stephanie had tried to belittle me, erase me, and now she was turning her cruelty toward my son. I didn't know how their marriage would unfold, but one thing was certain: I would not let her break him. The morning after Marcus's phone call, I woke up with a heaviness I couldn't shake. It wasn't just about what Stephanie had said to him, it was about the way it echoed all the things I had feared when he first introduced her to me. I had hoped I was wrong, that love would soften her sharp edges. But people rarely change unless they want to, and Stephanie wanted the world to change around her, not the other way around. I made breakfast, grits, eggs, and toast, but hardly touched it. My mind was on Marcus. He was a man now, with a job, a home, and a wife, but in my heart he would always be the boy who looked to me for reassurance after every scraped knee and every lost basketball game. And now he was hurting in a way I couldn't fix with a hug or a home-cooked meal. Later that week, Marcus came by. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, dark circles under his eyes. I pulled him into a hug before he could say a word. "Come sit," I said, guiding him to the couch. He sank into the cushions, running a hand through his hair. "We fought again," he admitted. "What about this time?" I asked gently. "Everything," he sighed. "Money, work, my schedule. She says I don't try hard enough, that I'm content being average. She even said she wonders what people think of her for marrying me." My chest ached. "Marcus, does she make you feel loved?" He was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Sometimes," he said finally, "when things are good, she can be sweet, affectionate. But most of the time, it feels like I'm always falling short." I reached for his hand, squeezing it firmly. "That's not love, baby. Real love doesn't make you feel small. It lifts you up, even when you stumble." His eyes filled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. "I don't know what to do. You don't have to decide everything today," I told him softly. "But you do need to ask yourself if this marriage is making you better or breaking you down." He nodded, but I could see the war raging inside him. A few days later, I ran into Stephanie at the grocery store. She was dressed immaculately, as always, heels clicking against the floor even in the middle of the produce section. She spotted me before I could turn away, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Angela," she said smoothly. "What a surprise." "Stephanie," I replied evenly, selecting a bag of apples. She leaned against her cart, tilting her head. "Marcus has been distant lately. I assume you've noticed." My grip on the apples tightened. "He's tired." "Marriage isn't easy." Her smile sharpened. "Marriage is about matching, about finding someone who fits your world. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus is really cut out for mine." I turned to face her fully. "Marcus doesn't need to fit into your world. You're supposed to build a world together. That's what marriage is." Her eyes flickered, but she quickly masked it. "Well, not everyone sees it that way." I placed the apples in my cart, meeting her gaze steadily. "If you keep measuring him against your standards instead of loving him for who he is, you'll lose him. And it won't be because he wasn't enough, it'll be because you couldn't see what was right in front of you." Her expression hardened, and for once she had no quick retort. I walked away, my heart pounding but my head held high. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Marcus showed up at my house late at night, his eyes red, his clothes disheveled. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "She threw me out," he said, his voice hoarse. My stomach dropped. "What happened?" He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "We argued again. She said she was tired of living with someone who wasn't ambitious enough for her. She said marrying me was a mistake." Tears filled my eyes, but I held them back. "Marcus, listen to me. You are not a mistake. You are a blessing. You are my son, and you're more than enough." He looked up, his eyes brimming with pain. "I don't understand how she can say she loves me one day and then tear me down the next." I knelt in front of him, taking his hands in mine. Because her love isn't real, baby. Real love doesn't humiliate you. Real love doesn't make you doubt your worth. Real love stands by you when the world is heavy. He broke down then, sobs racking his body. I held him, stroking his back the way I had when he was a boy. The next morning, he packed a bag and moved back into my house for now, he said. But I knew the truth. His marriage was hanging by a thread, and it wasn't my job to tie the knot tighter. It was my job to remind him he didn't need to chain himself to someone who couldn't see his value. News spread quickly. Within days, whispers circled Atlanta society. Marcus had left Stephanie, at least temporarily. Some people expressed shock, others sympathy, but I ignored it all. My focus was on my son, on helping him piece himself back together. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Marcus turned to me. Mom, do you think I made a mistake marrying her? I took a deep breath. No, Marcus, you made a choice based on love. That's never a mistake. The mistake would be staying in something that destroys you. He nodded slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. For the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of peace in his eyes. But I also knew Stephanie wouldn't let go so easily. She wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, and something told me her next move would be the hardest one yet. Marcus had been staying with me for nearly 3 weeks when Stephanie finally made her move. Until then, there had been silence between them, no phone calls, no visits, just an occasional text from her that he often ignored. I could see the tension in his shoulders loosening a little more each day. He was eating better, sleeping longer, laughing with me over silly things on television. For the first time in months, he seemed like himself again. Then, one Saturday morning, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Stephanie stood there. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored cream suit and heels that clicked against my porch. But her face told another story. Tired eyes, lips pressed tight, a certain sharpness softened by desperation. Angela, she said flatly, is Marcus here? I crossed my arms. He is. But you'll have to wait until I ask if he wants to see you. Her brows shot up. He's my husband. I don't need permission to see him. Yes, you do, I replied calmly. In this house, you do. Before she could argue further, Marcus appeared behind me. Stephanie, he said, his voice weary. She tried to step forward, but I held my ground until Marcus touched my arm gently. It's okay, Mom. I'll talk to her. Reluctantly, I moved aside. They stepped out onto the porch while I lingered inside, close enough to hear but far enough to give them space. Stephanie's voice was sharp at first. Marcus, you can't just walk out. You made vows. I didn't walk out, he said evenly. You pushed me out. Every day, you made me feel like I wasn't enough. That's not a marriage. Her tone softened, almost pleading. I was frustrated. I wanted more for us, for our future. More for you, Marcus corrected. Not for us. You never asked me what I wanted. You just told me what I wasn't. There was a pause. Then her voice cracked. I don't want to lose you. I peeked through the window and saw her gripping his arm, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Maybe she truly did love him in her own way. But love without respect is like a house without a foundation, it always crumbles. Marcus pulled gently away. Stephanie, I don't know if love is enough when it hurts this much. Her face hardened again. And what about your mother? She asked, bitterness lacing her tone. Ever since the wedding, it's been her. Do you know how humiliating it is to feel second in my own marriage? I bristled from inside, but forced myself to stay put. Marcus's voice was steady, though tinged with anger. My mother raised me on her own. She gave me everything she had so I could stand where I am today. She is not the reason our marriage is failing. The reason is you can't see my worth unless it's reflected in dollar signs and status. Stephanie's face flushed red. So that's it? You're choosing her over me? He shook his head slowly. I'm choosing myself. And if that means I can't be with you, then that's what it means. Her breath hitched, and for a second she looked like she might crumble right there on the porch. But instead, she straightened her shoulders, adjusted her jacket, and said coldly, "You'll regret this." Then she turned and walked down the steps, her heels clicking like gunshots against the pavement. Marcus came back inside, his face pale but resolute. He sank onto the couch, running both hands over his face. "It's over, Mom. I think it's really over." I sat beside him, resting a hand on his back. "Sometimes endings are beginnings in disguise," I said softly. He didn't answer right away, but leaned into me, resting his head against my shoulder like he had when he was a child. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and tense phone calls. Stephanie filed for separation, and though she fought hard for appearances, it was clear to everyone that the marriage had fractured beyond repair. Marcus handled most of it quietly, but there were nights when he broke down, the weight of failure pressing heavy on him. One evening, as we sat on the porch again, he turned to me. "Do you think I failed, Mom?" I shook my head firmly. "No, baby, you didn't fail. You tried. You loved. And sometimes love isn't enough when respect isn't there. That's not failure, that's life teaching you what you deserve." He nodded, his eyes glistening, and I could see the words sinking into his heart. Months passed, and the whispers in Atlanta society grew quieter. People had moved on to fresher gossip, as they always do. Stephanie retreated into her circle, still hosting events, still playing the part of the polished socialite. But her name didn't carry the same shine it once did. The cracks were visible now, even from the outside. As for Marcus, he began to rebuild. Slowly, carefully, he found his footing again. He threw himself into his work, reconnected with old friends, and started therapy to untangle the knots of pain Stephanie had left behind. Watching him heal was like watching a wound close slow, sometimes painful, but steady. And me? I found a new peace too. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I attended shareholder meetings regularly now, no longer hiding in the shadows. I spoke with confidence, knowing my voice mattered. But the memory of that wedding day, the sting of those words, "You're just a cleaner," never fully left me. Instead, it became fuel. Fuel to remind me that I was more than anyone's narrow definition. Fuel to keep standing tall, no matter who tried to cut me down. One afternoon, months later, I received an invitation in the mail. It was from Stephanie. She was hosting yet another gala at Whitaker Hall. I stared at the elegant envelope, the embossed lettering, the polished formality. For a moment, I considered tossing it aside. But then I smiled. No, I would go. Not out of spite, but out of strength. Because every time I walked into that hall, I wasn't just a guest. I was part of its foundation, and no one could erase that. The night of the gala, I walked into Whitaker Hall wearing a sapphire blue dress that shimmered under the lights. I felt every bit the woman I had become, seasoned, steady, unshakable. Guests greeted me warmly, some recognizing me immediately as a shareholder, others simply sensing the quiet confidence I carried. Stephanie spotted me across the room. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she composed herself again. But in that flicker, I saw the recognition that I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't just a cleaner. I was the woman who had built her life from the ground up, who had stood in her truth even when others tried to bury it. And I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning of my story. The gala that night felt different from the others. Maybe it was the way I carried myself, or maybe it was the way people looked at me now with curiosity, respect, even admiration. Whatever it was, I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. I wasn't the woman hiding in the shadows of Whitaker Hall. I was standing in the light unapologetically. As I moved through the crowd, I overheard snippets of conversation. Guests whispered about the divorce, about Stephanie's strange smile, about Marcus living apart. People always talk, but for once, their words didn't sting. I had lived long enough to know that gossip fades. Truth is what remains. Stephanie eventually made her way toward me. She was dressed in a stunning silver gown, her hair swept back elegantly. From a distance, she looked flawless, but up close I could see the cracks, the forced smile, the faint tightness around her eyes. "Angela," she said smoothly, as if nothing had ever passed between us. "Stephanie," I replied, my voice calm but firm. For a moment, we just stood there, two women bound by the same man yet worlds apart in values. She sipped her champagne, eyes scanning the crowd before settling back on me. "You've certainly made a name for yourself here," she said, her tone laced with something sharp. "I didn't make it. I answered softly. I earned it. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't reply. Later that evening, Charles announced a new initiative. Whitaker Hall was launching a community program offering mentorship and scholarships to young people interested in hospitality management. To my surprise, he asked me to say a few words. I walked to the stage, my heart pounding but steady. The room grew quiet, all eyes on me. Good evening, I began, my voice carrying across the hall. Many of you know me as a shareholder here, but that's not where my story began. I started in this hall as part of the cleaning crew. I scrubbed these floors, polished these chandeliers, and worked long nights to make sure this place sparkled for events just like this. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but I pressed on. Back then, I never imagined I'd one day stand here speaking to you. But Mrs. Whitaker saw something in me. She reminded me that worth isn't defined by the job you do, but by the heart you put into it. And because of her, I'm here today not just as someone who cleaned these walls, but as someone who now helps shape their future. Applause filled the room, warm and genuine. I glanced at Marcus, who was beaming with pride, his eyes glistening. Stephanie, on the other hand, sat rigid in her seat, her face carefully composed but her hands gripping her glass too tightly. I ended with this. My hope for the next generation is that they see themselves not through the eyes of those who underestimate them, but through the eyes of those who believe in their potential. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to change the course of your life. The applause grew louder, and I stepped down from the stage with my head high. Afterward, guests approached me with kind words, some even sharing their own stories of starting at the bottom and working their way up. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were countless people who had been dismissed, underestimated, and yet had risen above. When the night ended, Marcus walked me to my car. Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion,